This is 9/11 Freefall.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is 9/11 Freefall. I'm your host, Andy Steele. The guest tonight is Dan Barnum. He's a board member with AE911Truth. He's also a member of the American Institute of Architects. He's actually a fellow with that organization. And in this interview I'm going to play for you tonight, he actually describes what it means to be a fellow at AIA. And he talks about the fact that right from day one, right from 9/11 itself, he was questioning the official story of what happened to the buildings in New York. He knew that there had to have been explosives that brought them down. And obviously that's a very lonely position to be in, for those few people who were questioning 9/11 right from the start. So he talks about that, and he also talks about some of the obstacles that we run into in reaching out to others with the evidence, in particular to building professionals. You know, a lot of folks who know better know that there's something wrong with the government's official explanation of what happened to those towers in New York on 9/11, but they push it away. They don't want to think about it. It's too scary for them. So what do? How do you get past that mental block that people put up? We'll be talking about that too. Before I do play the interview for you, though, I just want to bring attention to a video that somebody sent me. This is from a reality TV show called Biggest Nerd. And I guess the premise of the show is that they get a bunch of nerdy-looking people to be the contestants, and they have the actors from that movie Revenge of the Nerds as hosts, and they have to solve certain problems that are presented to them. It's a contest. In this particular clip, the challenge that they're presented with is that they have to figure out what will happen when weights are dropped onto layers of glass, and they have to guess how many glass sheets are going to be shattered when they do that. Now, the girl who ended up winning is named Danielle. She's got pink hair, and I'm going to play a clip for you. This is Danielle talking to the camera while she's trying to figure out the solution to the problem. I want you to hear what she says.
So funny. Night. The only thing that I've found that is even similar to what we're doing are people who are trying to disprove 9/11 being a terrorist attack. I have literally found probably 10 websites using an example of dropping a bowling ball through panes of glass to explain why the Twin Towers is a conspiracy.
But I have
So the girl who researched the 9/11 Truth sites ends up winning, and for just a moment, she brings exposure to the issue to an audience of people who may have never thought about the topic before, you know, the reality TV watchers. Now, I know she mischaracterizes the position of, I would say, most websites talking about 9/11 science truth, in particular the building destructions in New York. For instance, AE911Truth, which I volunteer for, doesn't get into complicity or proving or disproving whether or not terrorists involved. It just brings the evidence that the buildings were brought down in controlled demolitions. She doesn't mention any specific sites, though. But regardless of that, even though she mischaracterizes that debate, she gives validity to the issue. Because, again, she ended up winning. So, good for her and good for the movement, too. All right, what we're going to do now is what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that starting now. And that is 10 seconds. Dan Barnum is an architect and a member of AIA. He's been in practice since 1964, and he's designed all types of buildings, from small residences to high-rise buildings. Currently, he is a principal in a 9-person architectural firm that designs primarily churches and municipal buildings. Dan, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you very much.
Now, please elaborate on your education and your background for our audience. Anything that I left out that's important?
Okay, I'm a graduate of Rice Institute and later Rice University, the same institution with a different name. I got my first degree in 1960. I spent 3 years in the Navy and then went back and got a graduate degree in 1964. And since then I've been practicing architecture. I have worked for different size firms, including my own single-person firm. I became a partner or a principal in my current firm in 1993. I've been there ever since. My experience early on was with a large firm that participated in the design of several high-rise buildings in Houston, which I did because I was just a lowly draftsman at the time, did small roles, but began to learn about the design of high-rise buildings. Later on, I was with a different firm and was the project manager of a 22-story building in Akron, Ohio. And soon after that, I started my own business, working mainly on residential projects. And then, as said earlier, now I'm with a firm that does mostly churches and municipal buildings. And I do a lot of the non-church, non-municipal building projects, small office buildings, residential remodelings, and that sort of thing, sort of filling in the gaps and letting the rest of the firm do the other stuff.
And I just want to say to the audience that Dan is one of AE911Truth's experts. He's also a board member at AE911Truth. And again, he's designed these high-rise buildings. He knows what he's talking about when he talks about what happened on 9/11. Now, how did you yourself wake up to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence?
Well, I sort of knew that it had to be controlled demolition on day one. First of all, my older brother's an airline pilot, or was at that time an airline pilot, and he had told me about what the controls were for the airspace around New York and Washington. So number one, knew that something was wrong, that airplanes were allowed to be hijacked and not forced down or shot down. Next, I knew that the Twin Towers had both been designed to withstand an airplane flying into them without danger of collapse, because I had been quite concerned about that when they were designed and had read about the design of them and the structure and that sort of thing. So that was an anomaly. Then I watched the whole day and eventually saw Building 7 collapse, and I said there's only one way that building can have collapsed, and that's a controlled demolition. So all of that said to me, something is really wrong. We're not hearing the truth. We're seeing something that couldn't possibly have happened with 9/11. There were also a lot of other anomalies. Soon after it happened, they had pictures of the so-called hijackers in the airport, and I said, well, wait a minute, how would they have that? How would they have known that so soon after this happened? They had the president in the schoolroom in Florida, and I said, wait, that can't be. He would have been hustled off if something weren't fishy in this. So there were just too many signs, all on that first day, that said to me, there's something really wrong here. And then, as the days went on and as the news was reported and we got more details, it just became clearer and clearer to me that something was dreadfully wrong, and that we had, in essence, had a coup that had, for reasons that I certainly didn't understand, still not sure I understand, but I knew that those three buildings had been purposely collapsed, and I also knew that whatever had hit the Pentagon couldn't possibly have been an airplane. So, and then as soon as I heard about Richard Gage and his efforts, I became a member and signed the petition, and eventually met Richard and became a board member.
That must have been an extremely lonely position for you right on the day of September 11th, watching those two buildings come down, watching Building 7 come down later in the day, which obviously wasn't even hit by an airplane, knowing this had to be a controlled demolition, knowing that there was something fishy about the 9/11 story right from the start. It must have been very lonely as a professional or just as an individual American citizen. You know, while a lot of us didn't question it for the first couple of years afterwards, we got to live in that initial bliss of believing the government's official story. I mean, who did you talk to about this initially? Did you keep this to yourself, or did you talk to other architects?
Talked to other architects. I talked to my business partners. I talked to other friends, and none of them would. Well, I wouldn't say none of them, but most of them didn't come around, and most of them still won't come around. They don't even want to talk about it, and that's a very telling thing that people don't want to talk about this. It's as if they don't want to believe that something like that could happen purposely on the part of leadership in this country. I have some own personal ideas of who is behind this and that sort of thing, but to me that's not so important as the AE911Truth mission of getting a true, unbiased investigation into what really happened and get the full truth out, because it has not yet come out, and we need it to come out.
It amazes me, though, that architectural and engineering professionals wouldn't have even discussed the possibility in the days following 9/11, before any talk of any government involvement began, simply to discuss, could the airplane impacts have really caused this kind of damage that we witnessed on television? Even if you want to go from the angle of they attacked us because we're free, I'm surprised that more people wouldn't discuss what they saw and the reality of the controlled demolition, just to put a spotlight on potential terrorist or foreign involvement in getting explosives in the buildings. I don't know if you can remember that far back or recall how the conversations went, but when you talk to people about this, did they just immediately shut you down, not want to speak, or was there any kind of debate whatsoever about what was being said?
Well, what I remember is that the architects I talked to would acknowledge that there was a little bit strange, but then they were so inundated with the news over the news media, television, newspapers, news magazines, whatever, that the collapses of the buildings had been caused by the airplanes running into them, that was sufficient. And that was enough information for them, and so they just went on with life and said, okay, well, that's what happened, and we'll let other people worry about it. People still say to me, I don't want to think about that. I don't want to get into it. I don't want to worry myself about that.
It's interesting what you talk about, building professionals who know about how these things are built, obviously, and know how they come down or how they should not come down because of regular office fires. And so many of them still don't want to look at this. In your view, what could be done to erase this taboo from this issue so that more building professionals are comfortable speaking about this?
I wish I knew. When the NIST reports came out that according to them the cause of the collapses were building office fires, my reaction, which I said to many friends, architects and engineers, I said, okay, if these buildings collapse because of regular office fires, then every high-rise building in the world, at least every steel-framed high-rise building in the world, is in trouble, because if somebody has a short circuit and their wastebaskets catch on fire and they have a fire in their building, then that building is likely to collapse or could possibly collapse. And that doesn't make any sense, because we know that that's not true. We know that there have been raging fires in high-rise buildings and they haven't collapsed. So why doesn't that make any sense to you? And they just say, oh, I don't want to think about it. So, in fact, I've had friends who are smart engineers, people I went to college with, who said, that just doesn't make any sense. You're taking one thing and saying, well, if it happened here, it's going to happen everywhere. And that doesn't make any sense. And I said, why doesn't it? If a normal office fire can cause a 47-story building to collapse, why can't it cause a 22-story office building to collapse, or a 18-story or a 50-story office building to collapse? And why shouldn't everybody that works in one of them be worried that that's going to happen? Well, they're not worried because they know that that's a false thing. They know it in the back of their mind, whether they want to admit it or not.
Well, what I find very interesting, obviously the points you raise are very valid, even if somebody doesn't want to look at the deeper implications of the controlled demolition, simply finding out what really happened, so that if NIST was magically right, which obviously they're not, but if they were, how you prevent it from happening again. Something that to add on to that is the fact that they haven't been transparent, the fact that they haven't released the data that went into their computer models for Building 7, and as Richard Gage said when he was on C-SPAN, this is information we need as architects and engineers in order to make our buildings more safe. So actually, ironically, they're citing jeopardizing public safety as the reason they won't release this information, but by keeping this information secret, they're making the public less safe. I want to ask for your own 2 cents on that.
Of course, that makes no sense at all. If they know there's the reason that the collapse and what's behind it, but they won't tell us, then all of us are in the dark. All of us are, all of us who design buildings, and we don't design high-rise buildings anymore. My firm doesn't, but I know lots of people in Houston that do. Why shouldn't we have that information? Certainly it would make buildings safer if there is some flaw in the engineering or the building codes or something. Then we ought to know what it is. And I have gotten a few people to say, oh yeah, that's true. And I said, well, let's push for that. Oh no, we're not going to do that. So, we don't want to get involved. We don't want to worry about that. So it's as if they know in the back of their minds that what is being said is not possibly true, but at the same time, they don't want to acknowledge it. And I remember distinctly at the AIA convention I think it was the one in Denver, where I was there with Richard and others at the AE911 booth, and we were talking to architects that went by, and I grabbed a hold of one of them, not literally, but figuratively, and said, come look at this. And he said, I know what you're talking about, but if I acknowledge what you're saying, it's just too scary, and I can't handle it. And I think that's where an awful lot of people are. It's just too scary, and they're not going to handle it. There's too much else going on in their lives, and they're just not going to confront that. And I don't know what we can do about that, other than, if we could get maybe the New York Times or Time Magazine or something like that to come out and say, well, guys, we made a mistake 13 years ago, and we now realize that what we've been telling you is not the truth. Maybe that would change things, but I don't know. I don't know whether it would or not, because people just have gotten to the point where, to me, they just don't want to confront the truth. And I truthfully don't know what to do about that. I talk, and we have a little group here in Houston that we talk and try to spread the word, and people just say, no, I'm not going to pay attention to that. In so many words, that's what they're saying. I'm not going to pay any attention to that.
Well, I once had somebody proudly tell me that they just care about what happens within all four of the walls around them. They went and pointed to every single wall to emphasize the point, and that's all well and good. The problem is when you cop that kind of attitude, those four walls have a way of closing in on you. People can't live in a bubble. People can't keep their head in the sand. And I think this makes America less safe, because as more people wake up and people become more bold with the passing of time, they're able to look back at this and acknowledge certain realities, no matter how dark they may be. And as they see the media continuing a cover-up, and as they see government officials continuing to stonewall, they lose faith in those institutions. And I think rightfully so, but that's not a good situation for America. All right, that doesn't make us any more safe.
Not at all a good situation. And if we have, as we obviously do, a multi-leveled, I'll just call it a conspiracy, a multi-leveled conspiracy to hide the truth, and anybody that comes out and speaks the truth is sort of automatically chastised and belittled, so that people don't want to pay attention to those persons. Then I don't know what to do about that. I mean, that reminds me of what we used to ridicule in the Soviet Union back in the 1950s when I was in high school. The whole thing was, well, this is propaganda, and all they get is false stories and that sort of thing. And now we're experiencing exactly the same thing, and yet we don't have any dominant news media that will come out and say that. And I don't know whether they won't come out and say it because they're afraid they'll get shut down, or because they'll lose their advertising, or because they've just been coerced into it. It's just scary. But it is what it is, and so we just have to keep fighting and keep pushing and keep trying to wake people up. And I think we saw Richard on C-SPAN, and that's a major event. And if we can get more of that kind of thing going, then we will eventually win. I think we'll eventually win anyway, because we have to get that truth out. But there's so much else other than just 9/11 that we're told that's false, that there are many other things that are being hidden from us, and so all of that eventually has to come out. And when and if, I think not if, but when it happens is a big question.
Well, that's right, and obviously you're a very outspoken person, and you've talked about this issue from day one, from what you're telling me. Have you run into any kind of professional issues because of your advocacy for a new investigation into those building destructions?
I can't say that I have that any potential jobs have been denied my firm because of it. I have not been denied fellowship in the AIA, which is a very prestigious position. So I can't think of anything definite, but I also wouldn't be surprised if there are some folks that have, when they're considering hiring my firm, have Googled my name and seen that I'm a member of the board of AE911Truth and said, "Oh, we're not going to get involved with him," and which I wouldn't know at all. I wouldn't know that was the case. I have only had one person call me in the years that I've been on the board and said, did you know that you're listed as being active in Architects and Engineers for 911Truth? And I said, yeah. And that person said, oh, aren't you worried about that? And I said, no. And he said, okay, and hung up. I don't even remember who it was. It was somebody that I know here in the architecture community in Houston.
Well, there was that one gentleman who was an engineer. I met him on one of the anniversaries. I think it was a year ago, and he had just signed the petition 3 days before. And for lack of having the direct quote in front of me, he said something to the effect that he had put off signing it because he was worried about what future employers might say looking at it. But then he determined that now, because of the momentum of AE911Truth and everything that we're doing, that this is something that might help his future employment, that an employer might look at his signing the petition as something positive and something that they would want him on their staff because he is willing to acknowledge truth and do what's right, essentially. So I think the momentum is shifting. Now, you mentioned AIA, the prestige that title holds. What does that mean in the world of architects? How important is that title for us to have, people with that title, for us at AE911Truth to have in our ranks?
Well, being a member of the American Institute of Architects has long been a valuable association. I will say that because of a lot of different issues, and I think 911Truth is one of those, there has been some diminishment in the prestige of the organization, but that has been realized in the last couple of years, and there's a major effort right now to turn around that. And part of that effort is that they have formed a task force to actually investigate our being AE911, our holdings on 9/11 and what was actually happened, and rather than sort of blindly just backing what NIST said, which is basically what they've done, they're now saying, oh, well, let's look at that in more detail. And there's an ongoing task force of the board of AIA looking at that. So that is ongoing, and that is happening right now. But the American Institute of Architects is still a very prestigious organization, and the fact that I'm a fellow, I am one of, I don't know, there are, 83,000 members of AIA, and there are 2,200 fellows, so it's a relatively small percentage, and so having that fellowship, which is modestly a distinct honor, is, I think, important to for me to be on the board and for me to be a petition signer. There are, I don't know, maybe 10 other FAIA that are also petition signers, and all of that makes a difference. So there's certainly not a large firm in the country whose leading principals are not members of the AIA. So it's an important thing. I know of a number of smaller firms, usually 2 or 3 people at the most in Houston, whose members are not members of AIA. I mean, whose principals are not members of AIA. But that's largely a factor of cost, because it's, I don't know, $450 a year to belong. And, if you're a struggling single practitioner, that's $450 that you can spend somewhere else. So, but the organization itself is quite prestigious, and they are finally realizing that they better start looking at stuff like this, because they're going to be held in ridicule if they don't.
Right, and you mentioned that you're a fellow at AIA. Before the broadcast, we were talking, and I thought that the F meant former AIA. You explained to me that difference. I'm glad you did. What does being a fellow mean for audience members who don't know that?
Well, it just means that the fellow has because of his efforts to enhance the profession and and there are 5 different categories of fellowship, 5 different levels of expertise, and that's not the right term. 5 different categories, I guess, is better. One of which is design, one of which is service to the public, one of which is service to the profession, one of which is teaching, and the 5th is service in organizations that are not architecture, but where the architect is beneficial, like being a college professor or being the leader of a development company or something like that. I got in because of service to the public through various things that I have done here in Houston. Typically, it's an organization that honors national attention, but some cases, like in mine, it's really more of a local thing but something that is probably has some effect nationally. And it's just an honor that's given to people who have been bold and I can't think of the words right now, but bold in their service to the profession in one way or another. Most often, I would say that it's through design, exemplary design, but certainly not always. And actually, most of the people that I know that are fellows are through one of the other means. It's through service to the public or service to the profession, like somebody who becomes the national president of AIA or a board member or something like that will, after spending years of active service to the profession, become a fellow as just a recognition of that dedicated service.
Well, I think that there should be consideration of nomination in the future for each one of the architects who have signed the petition, AE911Truth, for fellowship because of their courage and their responsibility in standing up for the integrity of their profession. That may in fact happen because at some point it's going to be known and that will be recognized as something that's important. Now, as a board member for AE911Truth, what do you consider to be your most important responsibility?
What I think I can do best is figure out ways to convince more and more people of the truth of what happened so that we can ultimately get the investigation that we're seeking. And also I have, not so much now, but when I first got on the board, there were some other board members that we had to consistently sort of rein in because they wanted to enlarge the scope of architects and engineers for 911Truth, whereas when Richard first started it, his goal was to get the investigation about the 3 high-rise buildings and not be concerned with any of the rest of the stuff that happened on 9/11. And that's sometimes difficult to do because there's so much else that happened, and there's so much other facts that need to be looked at. But we, as architects and engineers, figured that that's the place where we can serve best, and that's one of the things that I want to do is push other architects and engineers to taking a serious look at this and to quit sort of hiding behind the obviously to me anyway, false stories in the news media, and actually get on with investigating. And as a couple of weeks ago, I met with the incoming president of National AIA and talked with her about the issues. And just encourage that when she becomes president in January, that she continue the work of the task force and continue their investigation into the issues. And she agreed that that was an important thing to do, which I thought was very important. So that's what I see as my role. There are other board members that are much more aware of financial issues and that are much better at planning individual events and that sort of thing than I am. So I look at what I think is my strength and go from there.
Well, that's what we have to do. I mean, there's people listening to this program right now who may not know how to help, how they can contribute to this cause. It's basically any way that you feel like doing it. If you're an artist, make a painting depicting the evidence. If you're a writer, a fiction writer, write a book or a novel. I'm just thinking in terms of my own little sphere of people that I hang out with, but there's lots of people with various talents that can be contributed to this cause, and I always encourage people to bring it. And you talked about the wider scope of 9/11, the bigger picture. I look at it sort of like the story of David and Goliath, and some people might look at our story as being like that, except I think the odds are a little better. I think it's kind of like David versus Goliath, but David knows judo and karate and any other martial arts. But in that story, taking on the big giant, obviously he's not trying to fight the entire giant, fight on the giant's terms. He takes a slingshot and hits the giant in the head at the right spot and brings them down. And I kind of look at Building 7 as being that right spot, that point where they really screwed up. Somebody made a mistake either in the planning or whatever, but it became obvious, and they had to know. Architects and engineers for the next decades would be talking about this. Now, maybe they had a lot of arrogance and they thought they would that they could keep a lid on it, but they can't for much longer. I mean, we are gaining ground.
They had a lot of arrogance. I mean, certainly there's a lot of arrogance on the part of those that did it, and anybody that thinks about it for more than 15 minutes has got to realize that 19 relatively uneducated Arabs could not have possibly pulled it off, and so there had to be some other organization involved. Now, who that is subject to a lot of controversy. I mean, there's obviously a lot of people who don't believe the true story but have different ideas of what the true story is, and that's why we need a real investigation. But one of the things to go back to what I think I can do is I also write. At least once a month, I write a letter to one of my what I hesitate to call representatives, but representatives in Congress, because I don't think they represent me very well. But to write a letter to them and say, you really need to look at this. This is something that we can't gloss over any longer, and the longer you do, the sillier you're going to look when the truth actually comes out. So it's time to start changing your mind and opening your mind to the reality. I can't say I've gotten anywhere with that, but keep trying.
Well, I kind of look in my own perspective as time existing all at once in a sense, and right now our Congress is being judged by the future, because eventually this is going to come out. This is going to be laid bare for everybody. Now, whether it's tomorrow or 100 years from now, people are going to know what really happened, and they're going to look back at these people stonewalling and essentially closing their eyes to basic physics and common sense, and they're going to look at them as ridiculous. And I don't want that. I want these people to shine. I want America to shine. But the longer we put this off, the worse it's going to be. I'm curious because you brought this up, and I've asked this question on the show before to other guests. I want to hear your take. How much concentration should we have on government outreach versus the general public outreach?
Well, my own personal view is I think public outreach is going to be far more effective than government outreach. I think people in government are, for the most part, too scared, too fearful to, even if they, let's say a junior engineer at NIST knows that what they've said is not possibly true, but he's not going to come out and say that because he'd lose his job, and he doesn't want to lose his job. So, or we just have to look at what's happened in the last 10 years, say, for whistleblowers of any sort in the government, and see how they don't hold their position. They're not compensated the way they're supposed to be. They're not. All of that stuff that's supposed to happen doesn't happen, and they lose their jobs, and they're not able to get new ones, and that sort of thing. And so, to me, it's not going to be a governmental thing. It's going to have to be the public finally coming to grips with reality and pushing and pushing and pushing, and until the dam breaks and the flood happens, which is what I see happening at some point somehow. Right now I'm reading a book about the flood of the Mississippi River in 1927 and how it just got higher and higher and higher, and all of a sudden there's a break and it relieves the pressure on, and I think that same kind of thing will eventually happen with 9/11, that there'll be more and more and more pressure, and then at some point somebody's going to say, okay, enough, we're going to tell the truth now, and we're going to let it all happen. But, we look at other incidents that have happened in this country that have been kept secret for years and years and decades, and what possibly couldn't happen, and people still won't believe that we're being lied to. I think mainly of the assassination of John Kennedy. What we're told couldn't possibly have happened. That I didn't know that right away when it happened, but several years later, when we got more and more information, it became clear that what we were being told wasn't what really happened. And I think eventually that story will come out, and 9/11 will come out, and other stories will come out. And we'll have people like Snowden exonerated.
Right, and something I've learned in life, folks, is how quickly the wind can change, how quickly stuff seems to come out of nowhere. And it doesn't really come out of nowhere. There's conditions building up to it, but you don't always see it. You don't always know that when things are going to change, but things could be different in one single day, just out of nowhere. And so in this case, we could have justice come in the form of some event, some revelation, some great new story. You don't know. So that's why you got to keep pushing and planting those seeds and telling people about this evidence. Now, there's a lot of people out there who may be listening to this program. They're not architects or engineers. They may not feel comfortable or as comfortable talking about this evidence as yourself, because you're an expert. But what's the best and quickest way for a layman to explain the evidence that AE911Truth brings forth? How would our listeners best present this if they only had one point to stick in another person's head?
My first recommendation is to read David Ray Griffith's book, A New Pearl Harbor, because I think that very, very clearly and in a relatively short book spells out a very good outline of why it couldn't possibly have happened the way it was said it was happened. And basically, all he does in that book is point out anomalies and ask questions. He doesn't come to conclusions. And I think if somebody reads that book, then they can say, then they have the background that they need to explain. I wouldn't say to anybody, well, it's really clear that it couldn't be regular office fires, because if regular office fires were the cause of it, then all high-rise buildings are in trouble, because most lay people are not going to understand that. So you've got to get each individual lay person or person, even if that person's an architect or engineer that hasn't really looked at it, they need to get a broad base of understanding, and that's why I recommend David Ray Griffith's book, because to me that's the best one. That's not the first one I read that pointed out all the anomalies, but it's the one that I keep recommending to people because it's so thorough and so well written. And he's written 9 books, 10 books about the subject, but that's the best one as far as I'm concerned. And that's what I always recommend. In fact, I've given away many copies of that book. I don't know how many people I've given it to have really read it, but and I know a number of people that have received it have not read it because they haven't changed their mind. But nevertheless, that's what I ask people to do, and that if I get somebody that really wants to gain some more information, I'll discuss it with them, but I always recommend that they read that book.
Now, earlier you mentioned achieving justice and waiting for that dam to break. Do you think it's still possible to achieve a justice in America on this issue? Sure.
If I didn't think so, I would have given up. And, you know, I certainly have other things I can do with my life, and other ways I can spend the time that I otherwise spend on it. So to me, it's got to. For this country to survive, we have to start looking at truth, because we cannot continue head in the sand kind of looking at things. It just won't work. We already, I don't know if you know, but most of the people in the world that are reasonably well-read know that what we are being told in the United States about 9/11 is not true. People in Europe, people in Asia, people in Australia, they all are aware that the story we are being told is not a true story, and they quite truthfully don't understand why we are being told that consistently and why we continue to believe it, we as a country. But ultimately, that's all going to come out. It's got to. So I'm guardedly optimistic. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but it will certainly happen in the next 100 years, as far as I'm concerned.
Now, have you talked to other people from other countries? Have they commented on this situation we find ourselves in with this issue?
I have read newspaper articles and magazine articles in European newspapers, yes. And I've read comments from national or international correspondents that have said that. Mostly they're correspondents from European newspapers, but they have reported it pretty widely that it's not a story that the story that we are being told is not the story that intelligent people around the world realizes. I mean, that's not what they think is true. They realize that we're not being told the truth.
Now, you mentioned people keeping their head in the sand and the hazards that come from a public that doesn't pull their head out of that sand. I've asked this question a number of times of other guests. I'm going to ask you, what happens to America, to our country, our Constitution, all of that? What happens if we can't get the public to acknowledge what really happened to those buildings in New York on 9/11?
Well, to me, that would just be one cog in the overall breakdown of the country. Which, if that kind of truth doesn't come out and can't come out, then, as I see it, ultimately there's the whole truthful situation of where we are as a country and the dysfunction of the Federal Reserve and the other things that have happened that we're not told the truth about. All of that will eventually break down, and there may be a revolution. There may be, it may be a revolution, a very quiet revolution, but there's going to have to be a major change. And if we want to survive it well, then to me, it gradually has to come out, and it can't just cascade on us like a Niagara Falls. It has to be sort of a relatively slow trickle that just lets things out slowly, or we're going to just have a major confrontation of the people against the government and a real breakdown. And I don't know that that's not going to happen anyway, but I hope it doesn't. I hope there's other ways of handling the problem. I can't say that I've really thought about that a whole lot of what the ideal way of handling the situation is, but I don't know. I begin to think that some of the people that are running things don't really think through things on a long-term basis, and so they trap themselves in difficult situations. And I think maybe that's where we are right now. We're getting more and more trapped in a situation that is ultimately going to have to break free, and it's likely to be very chaotic when it does.
Well, I follow the news almost daily, and I don't get into geopolitics on the show, but I see a tremendous potential for disaster on the global scale, and given America's shrinking prominence in the world, this issue playing a large part in that, I think that we absolutely need to expose this just as the medicine that America needs to take in order to get its own government under control. And maybe that's why I sometimes am a little impatient to get things done, because I never know, like I said earlier in this program, how fast the winds can change, what situation might be different tomorrow, and how our ability to reach people might be limited before you know it. Now, what can our audience do to better help AE911Truth? What are the things that average Americans who know about this issue want to do something? How can they fight in this information war?
Well, I would say, just sort of on the spur of the moment, that we do a two-prong look. We alert our representatives in Congress, and on state and local level as well, to try to get as much knowledge out there as possible. And then we also just tell as many people as we're confident talking to about it. You know, some people would be confident speaking to a group of 200, and some people might be only comfortable talking to a group of 2. So, but whatever people are comfortable doing, then do it. And I urge everybody that I talk to that seems to come around, I said, well, talk to a few other people. And, you know, if they want to know more information, have them call me. So we have a small group here in Houston that's Houston 911Truth, and it's growing slowly. So it's beginning to work. And we've had our ups and downs in terms of the active people in it, but some people have left the group because they get frustrated that it doesn't move fast enough, and but others are slowly joining, and they're writing letters and that sort of thing. So, you know, I don't know beyond that. It's all just going to take more and more and more people knowing about it and putting pressure.
Well, I've said it so many times on this show, and it's funny. Sometimes you can be listening to something, not looking for any real deep insight or profound statements, and you hear it. And I heard it in an old episode of The Great Gildersleeve. I like old-time radio, and it was during World War II, and they put a lot of World War II propaganda in it, but he said about the war effort at that time that 1 million small things, done well every day is going to be what wins this for us. And so I apply that to this struggle, our current battle for intellectual freedom in America. It's not having some major event happen that is going to win. I mean, those things are going to help, and obviously they're important, but it's also the small things. It's the leaving brochures on park benches for people to come across, or at the mall. It's talking to others, being what I call a human radio, where you have a conversation with your friend on the subway ride to work, and other people can hear you. You talk, I mean, you don't want to be shouting, but you want to be audible for other people and speak unapologetically. It's changes in attitudes. It's small things that we do that have a big impact because they pile up, and I think that's something that the establishment, the media and government, can't control. They can't control your individual actions. I mean, they can control the channels with which we give out information if we want to use TV or newspapers, but they can't control what you individually do or your individual conversations with other people. And I think that's important. Attitude changes and small things. That's going to be what wins this war for us and why we need to be speaking out. Now, do you have any final thoughts in our last minute or so? One
more aside. Years ago, probably 5 years ago, I wrote, soon after the NIST report came out, I wrote a letter to the editor of each of the major architectural magazines in the country, and there are 5 of them, or were at the time. I think one of them's out of business now. And I said, I cannot remember any article in any magazine that relates to the architecture profession that has discussed the collapse of the World Trade Center towers on 9/11. Even after the NIST report, there hasn't been any discussion, nothing. What that says to me is that there is a behind-the-scenes effort to stifle information and to keep it, because for an architecture magazine not to write about that is irresponsible. As an example, there was a sky bridge in a hotel in Kansas City that collapsed with a whole bunch of people on it and killed a bunch of people. And there was immediately an investigation that went into it, and that investigation was followed, and a thorough report was published in each of the major architecture magazines 2 years later when the report came out as to what caused it and why, and how the support rods were not installed properly and broke and that sort of thing. Nothing like that has happened in the architectural press with the World Trade Center towers. And to me, that indicates that somebody is really scared of speaking the truth and getting it out. And so there's somebody back there that's pushing and saying, don't come out with that. Don't do that. Don't. And that, to me, is really scary. That if the architecture press is scared to talk about the collapse of a building, then we're in real trouble. And everybody listening to this needs to know that kind of stuff is going on, and we need to do everything we can to keep it from continuing to happen.
Dan Barnum, thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
You're welcome.
Remember, you can hear this program every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of this show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.